Swann by Marcel Proust. Part 1. Cambrai. For a long time I went to bed early, sometimes my candle scarcely out. My eyes would close so quickly that I did not have time to say to myself, "I'm falling asleep." And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to try to sleep would wake me. I wanted to put down the book I thought I still had in my hand and blow out my light. I had not ceased while sleeping to form reflections on what I had just read. But these reflections had taken a rather peculiar turn. It seemed to me that I myself was what the book was talking about. A church, a quartet, the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. This belief lived on for a few seconds after my waking. It did not shock my reason, but lay heavy like scales on my eyes and kept them from realizing that the candlestick was no longer lit. Then it began to grow unintelligible to me, as after metempsychosis do the thoughts of an earlier existence. The subject of the book detached itself from me. I was free to apply myself to it or not. Immediately I recovered my sight, and I was amazed to find darkness around me, soft and restful for my eyes, but perhaps even more so for my mind, to which it appeared a thing without cause, incomprehensible, a thing truly dark. I thought I would ask myself what time it might be. I could hear the whistling of the trains which, remote or nearby, like the singing of a bird in a forest, plotting the distances, described to me the extent of the deserted countryside where the traveler hastens toward the nearest station, and the little road he is following will be engraved on his memory by the excitement he owes to new places, to unaccustomed activities, to the recent conversations and the farewells under the unfamiliar lamp that follow him still through the silence of the night, to the imminent sweetness of his return. I would rest my cheeks tenderly against the lovely cheeks of the pillow, which, full and fresh, are like the cheeks of our childhood. I would strike a match to look at my watch. Nearly midnight. This is the hour when the invalid who has been obliged to go off on a journey is cheered to see a ray of light under the door. How unfortunate it's already morning. In a moment the servants will be up. He will be able to ring. Someone will come help him. The hope of being relieved gives him the courage to suffer. In fact, he thought he heard footsteps. The steps approach, then recede, and the ray of light that was under the door has disappeared. It is midday. It is midnight. They have just turned off the gas. The last servant has gone, and he will have to suffer the whole night through without remedy. I would go back to sleep. I would sometimes thereafter wake again for brief moments only, long enough to hear the organic creak of the woodwork, open my eyes and stare at the kaleidoscope of the darkness, savor in a momentary glimmer of consciousness the sleep into which were plunged the furniture, the room, that whole of which I was only a small part, and whose insensibility I would soon return to share. Or else, while sleeping, I had effortlessly returned to a period of my life that had ended forever, rediscovered one of my childish terrors, such as my great-uncle pulling me by my curls, a terror dispelled on the day, the dawn for me of a new era, when they were cut off. I had forgotten that event during my sleep. I recovered its memory as soon as I managed to wake myself up to escape the hands of my great-uncle. but as a precautionary measure, I would completely surround my head with my pillow before returning to the world of dreams. Sometimes, as Eve was born from one of Adam's ribs, a woman was born during my sleep from the cramped position of my thigh, formed from the pleasure I was on the point of enjoying. She, I imagined, was the one offering it to me, my body, which felt in hers my own warmth, would try to find itself inside her. I would wake up. The rest of humanity seemed very remote compared to this woman I had left scarcely a few moments before. My cheeks were still warm from her kiss, my body aching from the wake of hers. If, as sometimes happened, she had the features of a woman I had known in life, I would devote myself entirely to this end, to finding her again, like those who go off on a journey to see a longed-for city with their own eyes, and imagine that one can enjoy in reality the charm of the dream. Little by little, the memory would fade of her. I had forgotten the girl of my dream. A sleeping man holds in a circle around him the sequences of the hours, the order of the years and worlds. He consults them instinctively as he waits and reads in a second the point on the earth he occupies, the time that has elapsed before his waking. But their ranks can be mixed up, broken. If toward morning, after a bout of insomnia, sleep overcomes him as he is reading, in a position quite different from the one in which he usually sleeps, his raised arm alone is enough to stop the sun and make a retreat, and in the first minute of his waking he will no longer know what time it is. He will think he has only just gone to bed. If he dozes off in a position still more displaced and divergent, after dinner sitting in an armchair for instance, the confusion among the disordered worlds will be complete. The magic armchair will send him traveling at top speed through time and space, and at the moment of opening his eyelids, he will believe he went to bed several months earlier in another country. But it was enough if, in my own bed, my sleep was deep and allowed my mind to relax entirely. Then it would let go of the map of the place where I had fallen asleep, and when I woke up in the middle of the night, since I did not know where I was, I did not even understand in the first moments who I was. I had only in its original simplicity the sense of existence, as it may quiver in the depths of an animal. I was more destitute than a cave dweller, but then the memory, not yet of the place where I was, but of several of those where I had lived and where I might have been, would come to me like help from on high to pull me out of the void from which I could not have got out on my own. I crossed centuries of civilization in 1 second, and the image, confusedly glimpsed, of oil lamps, then wing-collared shirts, gradually recomposed my self's original features. Perhaps the immobility of things around us is imposed on them by our certainty that they are themselves and not anything else, by the immobility of our mind confronting them. However that may be, when I woke thus, my mind restlessly attempting, without success, to discover where I was, everything revolved around me in the darkness, things, countries, years. My body, too, benumbed to moved, would try to locate according to the form of its fatigue the position of its limbs, so as to deduce from this the direction of the wall, the placement of the furniture, so as to reconstruct and name the dwelling in which it found itself. Its memory, the memory of its ribs, its knees, its shoulders, offered in succession several of the rooms where it had slept, while around it the invisible walls, changing place according to the shape of the imagined room, spun through the shadows. And even before my mind, hesitating on the threshold of times and space, had identified the house by reassembling the circumstances, my body, would recall the kind of bed in each one, the location of the doors, the angle at which the light came in through the windows, the existence of a hallway, along with the thought I had had as I fell asleep that I had recovered upon waking. My stiffened side, trying to guess its orientation, would imagine, for instance, that it lay facing the wall in a big canopied bed, and immediately I would say to myself, "Why, I went to sleep in the end, even though Mama didn't come to say good night to me." I was in the country, in the home of my grandfather, dead for many years, and my body, the side on which I was resting, faithful guardians of a past my mind ought never to have forgotten, recalled to me the flame of the night light of Bohemian glass, in the shape of an urn which hung from the ceiling by little chains, the mantelpiece of Sienna marble, in my bedroom at Cambrai, and my grandparents' house in faraway days, which at this moment I imagined were present without picturing them to myself exactly, and which I would see more clearly in a little while when I was fully awake. Then the memory of a new position would reappear, the wall would slip away in another direction. I was in my room at Madame St. Loup's in the country. Good Lord! It's 10 o'clock or even later. They will have finished dinner. Unless Thibault overslept during the nap I take every evening when I come back from my walk with Madame de St. Loup, before putting on my evening clothes. For many years since I have passed Cambrai, where, however late we return, it was the sunset's red reflection I saw on the panes of my window. It is another sort of life one leads at Tamsonville, at Madame St. Loup's. Another sort of pleasure I take in going out only at night, in following by moonlight those lanes where I used to play in the sun, and the room where I fell asleep instead of dressing for dinner. From far off I can see it, as we come back, pierced by the flares of the lamp, the lone beacon in the night. These revolving, focused evocations never lasted for more than a few seconds. Often, in my brief uncertainty about where I was, I did not distinguish the various suppositions of which it was composed any better than we isolate when we see a horse run, the successive positions shown to us by a kinetoscope. But I had seen sometimes one, sometimes another of the bedrooms I had inhabited in my life, and in the end I would recall them all in the long reveries that followed my waking. Winter bedrooms in which, as soon as you are in bed, you bury your head in a nest braided of the most disparate things. A corner of the pillow, the top of the covers, a bit of a shawl, the side of the bed, and an issue of the Debat roses, which you can, by cementing together, using the bird's technique of pressing down on it indefinitely. Where in icy weather the pleasures you enjoy is the feeling that you are separated from the outdoors, like the sea swallow, which makes its nest deep in an underground passage in the warmth of the earth, and where, since the fire is kept burning all night in the fireplace, you sleep in a great cloak of warmth, smoky air shot with the glimmers from the logs breaking into the flame again, a sort of immaterial alcove, a warm cave dug out of the heart of the room itself, a zone of heat with shifting thermal contours, aerated by draughts which cool your face and come from the corners, from the parts close to the window or far from the hearth, which have grown cold again. Summer bedrooms, where you delight in becoming one with the soft night, where the moonlight leaning against the half-open shutters casts its enchanted ladder to the foot of your bed, where you sleep almost in the open air like a titmouse, rocked by the breeze on the tip of a ray of light. Sometimes the Louis 14th bedroom, so cheerful that even on the first night I had not been too unhappy there, and where the slender columns that lightly supported the ceiling stood aside with such grace to show and reserve the place where the bed was. At other times, the small bedroom, with a very high ceiling, hollowed out in the form of a pyramid 2 stories high and partly paneled in mahogany, where from the first second I had been mentally poisoned by the unfamiliar odor of the vetiver, convinced of the hostility of the violet curtains and the insolent indifference of the clock chattering loudly as though I were not there, where a strange, pitiless, quadrangular cheval glass, bearing obliquely one of the corners of the room, carved from deep inside the soft fullness of my usual field of vision a sight for itself which I had not expected, where my mind, struggling for hours to dislodge itself, to stretch upward, as to assume the exact shape of the room, and succeed in filling its gigantic funnel to the very top, had suffered many hard nights while I lay stretched out in my bed, my eyes lifted, my ear anxious, my nostril restive, my heart pounding, until habit had changed the color of the curtains, silenced the clock, taught pity to the cruel oblique mirror, concealed, if not driven out completely, the smell of the vetiver, and appreciably diminished the apparent height of the ceiling. Habit! That skillful but very slow housekeeper who begins by letting our mind suffer for weeks in a temporary arrangement, but whom we are nevertheless truly happy to discover, for without habit our mind, reduced to no more than its own resources, would be powerless to make a lodging habitable. Certainly I was now wide awake. My body had veered around one last time, and the good angel of certainty had brought everything around me to a standstill, laid me down under my covers in my bedroom, and put approximately where they belonged in the darkness my chest of drawers, my desk, my fireplace, and the window onto the street, and the 2 doors. But even though I knew I was not in any of the houses of which my ignorance upon waking had instantly, if not presented me with distant pictures, at least made me believe the presence possible, my memory had been stirred. Generally, I would not try to go back to sleep right away. I would spend the greater part of the night remembering our life in the old days, in Cambrai, at my great-aunt's house, in Bolbec in Paris, in Dossiers in Venice, elsewhere still, remembering the places, the people I had known there, what I had seen of them, what I had been told about them. At Cambrai, every day in the late afternoon, long before the moment when I would have to go to bed and stay there, without sleeping, far away from my mother and grandmother, my bedroom again became fixed with the painful focus of my preoccupations. They had indeed hit upon the idea, to distract me on the evenings when they found me looking too unhappy, of giving me a magic lantern, which, while awaiting the dinner hour, they would set on top of my lamp, and after the fashion of the first architects and master glaciers of the Gothic age, it replaced the opacity of the walls with impalpable iridescence, supernatural, multicolored apparitions where legends were depicted as in wavering, momentary stained glass window. But my sadness was only increased by this, since the mere change in lighting destroyed the familiarity which my bedroom had acquired for me, and which, except for the torment of going to bed, had made it tolerable to me. Now I no longer recognized it, and I was uneasy there, as in a room in some hotel or chalet, to which I had come for the first time straight from the railway train, moving at this jerky pace of his horse, and filled with a hideous design. Golo would come out of the small triangular forest that velveted the hillside with a dark green, and advanced jolting towards the castle of poor Genevieve de Brabant. This castle was cut off along a curved line that was actually the edge of one of the glass ovals arranged in the frame, which she slipped between the groves of the lantern. It was only a section of castle, and it had a moor in front of it, where Guinevere stood dreaming, wearing a blue belt. The castle and the moor were yellow, and I had not had to wait to see them to find out their color since, before the glasses of the frame did so, the bronze sonority of the name Brabant had shown it to me clearly. Golo would stop for a moment to listen sadly to the patter read out loud by my great aunt, which he seemed to understand perfectly, modifying to his posture with a meekness that did not exclude a certain majesty, to confront the directions of the text. Then he moved off at the same jerky pace, and nothing could stop his slow ride. If the lantern was moved, I could make out Golo's horse continuing to advance over the window curtains, swelling out their folds, with their folds descending into their fissures. The body of Golo himself, in its essence as supernatural as that of a steed, accommodated every material obstacle. Every hindersome object that he encountered by taking it as his skeleton and absorbing it into himself. Even the doorknob he immediately adapted to and floated invincibly over with his red robe or his pale face, as noble and melancholy as ever, but revealing no disturbances at this transvertebration. It's a cool word. Certainly I found some charm in these brilliant projections, which seemed to emanate from Merovingian past and send out around me such ancient reflections of history. But I cannot express the uneasiness caused in me by this intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room I had at last filled with myself to the point of paying no more attention to the room than to that self. The anesthetizing influence of the habit had ceased. I would begin to have thoughts and feelings, and they are such sad things. That doorknob of my room, which differed for me from all the other doorknobs in the world, in that it seemed to open of its own accord without my having to turn it, so unconscious had its handling become for me, was now serving as an astral body for Jolo. And so, as they rang for dinner, I hastened to run to the dining room, where the big hanging lamp, ignorant of Jolo and Bluebeard, and well acquainted with my family and beef casserole, shed the same light as on every other evening, and to fall into the arms of Mamma, whom Genevieve de Brabant's misfortunes made all the dearer to me, while Jolo's crimes drove me to examine my own conscience more scrupulously. After dinner, alas, I soon had to leave Mamma, who stayed there talking with the others. In the garden, if the weather was fine, in the little drawing room, to which everyone withdrew if the weather was bad. Everyone except my grandmother, who felt that it's a pity to shut one indoors in the country, and who had endless arguments with my father on days when it rained too heavily, because he sent me to my room to read instead of having me stay outdoors. "That's no way to make him strong and active," she would say sadly, "especially that boy who so needs to build up his endurance and willpower." My father would shrug his shoulders and study the barometer, for he liked meteorology, while my mother, making no noise as to not disturb him, watched him with tender respect, but not so intently so as to try to penetrate the mystery of his superior qualities. But as for my grandfather, in all weathers, even in a downpour when Francois had rushed the precious wicker armchairs indoors so that they would not get wet, we would see her in the empty rain-lashed garden, pushing back her disordered gray locks so that her forehead could more freely drink in the salubriousness of the wind and rain. She would say, "At last one can breathe," and would roam the soaked paths too symmetrically aligned for her liking by the new gardener, who lacked all feeling for nature and whom father had not been asked since morning if the weather would clear. With her jerky, enthusiastic little step, regulated by the various emotions excited by in her soul by the intoxication of the storm, the power of good health, the stupidity of my upbringing, and the symmetry of the gardens, rather than by this desire, quite unknown to her, to spare her plum-colored skirts the spots of mud under which it would disappear, up to a height that was always for her maid a source of despair and a problem. When these garden walks of my grandmother's took place after dinner, one thing had the power to make her come inside again. This was, at one of the periodic intervals when her circular itinerary brought her back, like an insect in front of the lights of the drawing-room, where the liquors were set out on the card table, if my great-aunt called out to her, "Mathilde, come back and stop your husband from drinking cognac," to tease her. In fact, she had brought into my father's family so different a mentality that everyone poked fun at her and tormented her. Since liquors were forbidden to my grandfather, my great-aunt would make him drink a few drops. My poor grandmother would come in, fervently beg her husband not to taste the cognac. He would become angry, drink his mouthful despite her, and my grandmother would go off again, sad, discouraged, yet smiling, for she was so humble at heart and so gentle that her tenderness for others and the lack of fuss she made over her own person and her sufferings came together in her gaze in a smile in which, unlike what one sees in the faces of so many people, there was irony only for herself, and all of us a sort of kiss from her eyes, which could not see those cherished without caressing them passionately with her gaze. This torture which my great-aunt inflicted on her, the spectacle of my grandmother's vain entreaties and of her weakness, defeated in advance, trying uselessly to take the liquor glass away from my grandfather, were the kinds of things which you later become so accustomed to seeing that you smile as you contemplate them and take the part of the persecutor resolutely and gaily enough to persuade yourself privately that no persecution is involved. At that time they filled me with such horror that I would have liked to hit my grand-aunt. But as soon as I heard, "Mathilde, come and stop your husband from drinking cognac," already a man in my cowardice, I did what we all do, once we are grown up, when confronted with suffering and injustices. I did not want to see them. I went up to sob at the very top of the house next to the scholar room, under the roofs, in a little room that smelled of orris root, and was also perfumed by wild black currant bush, which had sprouted outside between the stones of a wall and extended a branch of flowers through the half-open window. Intended for a more specialized and more vulgar use, this room, from which during the day you could see all the way to the keep of Rosenville-le-Pin for a long time, served me as a refuge, no doubt because it was the only one I was permitted to lock. For all those occupations of mine that demanded an inviolable solitude, reading, reveries, tears, and sensuous pleasures. Alas, I did not know that, much more than her husband's little deviations from his regimen. It was my weak will, my delicate health, the uncertainty they cast on my future that so sadly preoccupied my grandmother in the course of those incessant perambulations, afternoon and evening, when we would see as it passed and then passed again, lifted slantward towards the sky, her beautiful face with its brown furrowed cheeks, which with age had become almost mauve, like the ploughed fields in autumn, crossed, if she was going out, by a veil half raised, which upon them, brought there by the cold or some sad thought, an involuntary tear was always drying. My sole consolation when I went upstairs for the night was that Mamma would come kiss me once I was in bed. But this good night lasted so short a time. She went down again so soon that the moment when I heard her coming up, then the soft sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, hung with little cords of plaited straw, passing along the hallway with its double doors, was for me a painful moment. It ushered in the moment that would follow, in which she would have left me, in which she would have gone back down, so that I came to wish that this good night I loved so much would take place as late as possible, so as to prolong the time of respite in which Mamma had not yet come. Sometimes when, after kissing me, she stopped at the door to go, I wanted to call her back to say, "Kiss me one more time." But I knew that immediately her face would look vexed, because the concession she was making to my sadness and agitation by coming up to kiss me, by bringing this kiss of peace to me, irritated my father, who found these rituals absurd, and she would have liked to introduce me to lose the need for them, the habit of it, far indeed from allowing me to acquire that of asking her when she was already on the doorstep for one kiss more. And to see her vexed destroyed all the calm she had brought me a moment before, when she had bent her loving face down over my bed and held it out to me like a host for a communion of peace, from which my lips would draw her real presence and the power to fall asleep. But those evenings, when Ma stayed so short a time in my room, were still sweet compared to the ones when there was company for dinner, and when, because of that, she did not come up to say good night to me. That company was usually limited to Monsieur Swann, Monsieur Swann, who, apart from a few acquaintances passing through, was almost the only person who came to our house at Cambrai. Sometimes, for a neighborly dinner, more rarely, after that unfortunate marriage of his, because my parents did not want to receive his wife. Sometimes after dinner, unexpectedly, on those evenings when, as we sat in front of the house under the large chestnut tree around the iron table, we heard at the far end of the garden, not the copious high-pitched bell that deafened in passing with its ferruginous, icy, inexhaustible noise, any person in the household who set it off by coming in without ringing, but the shy, oval, golden tinkling of the little visitor's bell. Everyone would immediately wonder, a visitor? Now who can that be? But we all knew very well it could only be Monsieur Swann, my great-aunt, speaking loudly to set an example in a tone of voice that she strained to make natural, said not to whisper that way, that nothing is more disagreeable for a visitor just coming in, who is led to think that people are saying things he should not hear, and they would send a scout, my grandmother, who was always glad to have a pretext for taking one more walk around the gardens, and who would profit from it surreptitiously by pulling a few rose stakes on the way so as to make the roses look a little more natural, like my mother, who always runs her hands through her son's hair to fluff it up after Barbara has flattened it too much. We would all remain hanging on the news my grandmother was going to bring us of the enemy, as though there had been a great number of possible assailants to choose among, and soon after my grandfather would say, "I recognize Swann's voice." In fact, one could recognize him only by his voice. It was difficult to make out his face. His aquiline nose, his green eyes under a high forehead framed by blonde, almost red hair, cut Bresson style. Because we kept as little light as possible in the garden so as to not attract mosquitoes. And I would go off, as though not going for that reason, to say that the syrups should be brought out. My grandmother placed a great deal of importance, considering it more amiable, on the idea that they should not seem anything exceptional, and for visitors only. Monsieur Swann, though much younger, was very attracted to my grandfather, who had been one of the closest friends of his father, an excellent man, but peculiar, in whom apparently a trifle was sometimes enough to interrupt the ardor of his feelings, to change the course of his thinking. Several times a year I would hear my grandfather at the table telling anecdotes, always the same ones, about the behavior of old Monsieur Swann upon the death of his wife, over whom he had watched day and night. My grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, had rushed to his side at the estate the Swanns owned in the vicinity of Cambrai, and, so that he would not be present at the coffining, managed to entice him for a while, all in tears, out of the death chamber. They walked for a short way in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly Monsieur Swann, taking my grandfather by the arm, cried out, "Oh, my old friend, what a joy to be walking here in such fine weather. Don't you think it's pretty, all these trees, these hawthorns, and my pond, which you've never congratulated me on? You look as sad as an old nightcap. Feel that little breeze? Oh, say what you like. Life has something to offer despite everything, my dear Amédée." Suddenly the memory of his dead wife came back to him, and no doubt feeling it would be too complicated to try to understand how he could have yielded to an impulse of happiness at such a time, he confided himself in a habitual gesture of his whenever a difficult question came into his mind, to passing his hand over his forehead, wiping his eyes and the lenses of his lorgnon. He could not be consoled for the death of his wife, but during the 2 years he survived her, would say to my grandfather, "It's odd. I think of my poor wife often, but I cannot think of her for long at a time. Often, but only a little at a time, like poor old Swann," had become one of my grandfather's favorite phrases. He uttered apropos of the most different sorts of things. I would have thought Swann's father was a monster if my grandfather, whom I considered a better judge of, and whose pronouncements, forming a legal precedent for me, often allowed me to later dismiss offenses I might have been inclined to condemn, had not explained what he had a heart of gold. That's why I'm going to stop for right now.